Welcome to Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science. I'm your host, GV Pawan Kumar. Uh, for a change, I have actually converted this particular podcast into an audiovisual episode in which I'll discuss 15 lessons that I have learned as a professor in India. I've been an independent academic scientist in India for more than 13 years or so. And this episode is an attempt to share some of the experiences of doing research and teaching in India. So here we go. The most important part of working in India is to understand people are equally important. This is the lesson number one. People are as important as infrastructure. So, as an experimental physicist, people and infrastructure at working place is of paramount importance. When I'm forced to sometimes prioritize between people and infrastructure, I would surely always go for the people. I have been extremely fortunate to work with, and I continue to work with excellent students, faculty colleagues, and also administrative staff. I think a good workplace essentially is defined by the people who occupy it. In that way, I am in no way neglecting the role of infrastructure in academia, especially in a country like India. As you know, it's very important that to have a good quality infrastructure, but people have a greater impact in academic life when compared to infrastructure. Therefore, the most important and the first lesson is people are as important as infrastructure, and in some cases, they might be even more important than infrastructure. The lesson number two uh, is to create internal standards in academic environment. Whether you like it or not, there will be evaluation and judgments on your research, on your teaching. Generally, every academic ecosystem has its own standards of evaluating people. These standards are generally principles which are targeted towards a group of people rather than individuals. So, therefore, it is important for me to realize what good work is and how to judge myself. So, as long as these internal standards are high and are properly met with consistency, the external evaluation process essentially becomes a kind of a secondary process. This attitude totally frees up the mind and importantly helps me to get kind of better knowledge of what I am doing, and also helps me to benchmark myself from my previous self. And this is an important point. So the benchmark is not somebody else, but your previous self. And this also means this brings in a new attitude to appreciate others' work. And this, I think, is a very important point when you are working in an environment where resource is not very kind of exclusive, or resource is not also very extensively available. Therefore, the lesson number two is to create internal standards. The lesson number three, and this is a lesson which I have been learning for a very long time, is to actually inculcate constancy and moderation in the work. So when it comes to any work, it is important to be consistent over a long period of time. An equally important aspect is to moderate the amount of work for a given particular period of time. So, most of the important work in research happens in units of months, if not years. Therefore, constant effort is necessary, and also moderation keeps the motivation very high and makes the work more enjoyable. Most of the time, binge working is not effective, although it might be sometimes attractive to really go into the lab, work for a long period of time. But sometimes it would really take a toll on your physical and mental health. And therefore, my lesson number three is to always have constancy and moderation. The lesson number four is to realize that writing is a great tool for thinking. One of the most underestimated tools of thinking is writing. Not just formal writing, but the process of external articulation of thought on paper does wonders, or rather, it can be also on a computer screen, so to speak. Countless times, I have obtained, clarified, and developed my thoughts only after I started writing about it. So therefore, writing should be and is an integral part of research, and it should not be just looked at as a communication tool. And this is a very critical lesson I have learned over the years, both as a PhD student, as a postdoc, and as a professor. Writing has really played a very critical role in whatever work we have been doing. The lesson number 5 is the realization of the importance of history and philosophy of science. Ever since I was an undergraduate, I have always been interested in history and philosophy of science. I have never taken a very formal humanities course. Of course, while I was doing BSc, we had wonderful lecturers, and we were taught English and Sanskrit by very reputed professors. But over the years, I've gradually started appreciating the role of history and philosophy to a larger extent, thanks to the main reason of asking a specific question, which is why I do what I do. When one is doing research, especially scientific research, this is a question which always keeps coming back to your mind. Why are you doing what you're doing? So having a reasonable knowledge of history and philosophy of science will help you to get a slightly broader context in which one is performing research. And this has been extensively useful for me in my own work. In fact, one of the main motivations for this particular thought process comes from Weinberg's very famous article titled Four Golden Lessons. Among them, one of the lessons is to explore the history of one subject so that one can obtain a slightly broader context. And that has always stayed in my mind, which is to realize the importance of history and philosophy of science. Now, the lesson number 6 is to consider teaching as a social responsibility. In Indian academia, scientific social responsibility is a buzzword. For me, the greatest social responsibility as an academic comes in the form of teaching. In larger scheme of things, somehow we tend to neglect the impact of conventional teaching, and the impact of conventional teaching both on teachers and on students. Also, that particular impact is not easily measured, but the joy one obtains seeing a student do very well is absolutely priceless. In fact, that is one of the most important and very heartening things about being in an academia, where you see a student kind of literally flowering and becoming a mature person, having really good thoughts, not only in terms of science, but also building their character. That is an impact which generally is not easily measurable. And that is something which we should be very careful about before discarding conventional teaching processes. So this particular local impact, what is very important is that I value much more than any other metrics what generally is discussed in rankings and other places. And the important aspect is that the feedback is right there, right in front of you. So therefore, it is a very important system of knowing whether you do have some kind of an interaction and an impact on a person with whom you are working. The lesson number 7 is exploring science, sports, and arts as a trinity. I love outdoor sports, including running, swimming, playing cricket, and many other sports. Equally, I enjoy listening to music, reading poetry, and appreciating any form of culture. Need not be only Indian culture, but it can be any form of culture from various different parts of the world. And I've found that it is not only made me a better person, but also has kind of positively impacted the work what I do. It has also made me realize that there is much more diversity than what I can comprehend. And this is an important realization, and I have been increasingly benefited out of this particular thought process. So, in that sense, science, sports, and arts, taken as a trinity, these human endeavors continue to enrich our lives. And therefore, I would always urge students and anybody, even anybody who is interested in doing some deep work, to take science, sports, and arts as some form of human endeavor, which will be very important and interesting for various different processes. Lesson number 8 is the emphasis on mental and physical health. The most important policy that I have set in my research group is this: to do effective and enjoyable work, your mental and physical health should be good. There is no point in doing good work at the expense of your health. Therefore, the priority will always be good health followed by good work. So there is no way you would be able to perform diligently and impact your society and your local community or global community without preserving yourself to put your 100%. So therefore it is very important for us to actually keep our mental and physical health in good shape. And now there is a slow realization in academia, especially in Indian academia, and you could see that there is a lot more discussion which is happening nowadays, which I think will hopefully kind of amplify. And also people will realize that mental health is as important as physical health. So therefore the lesson number 8 is to emphasize on mental and physical health. Lesson number 9: social media can be very effective if it is used properly. Social media has a unique reach. So especially if you are in India and you want to connect with the scientific world, social media is an excellent platform. Also there are many important platforms through which you can coordinate and communicate with various different people. Given the size and diversity of India, social media can also reach people from various backgrounds and languages. Languages is very important because India has so many languages, and it is important that science actually reaches out to people who may not be very conversant in English. And that is one of the most important aspect which I have learned over the years, that social media can play a very critical role. Of course, it has to be used responsibly. Social media can have great impact on how science is communicated within India and how India connects to the outside world and the scientific world. So, therefore, it is important for us to strategize the use of social media such that it reaches the right audience and also attracts them to go deeper into the further aspects of reading books, going deeper into the research, understanding various different processes in nature and in mathematical world. So social media can be an excellent uh, introduction to in-depth aspects of various different avenues which are available in education and research. So the lesson number 9 is that social media can be very effective if it is used properly. So lesson number 10 is my renewed interest in applied mathematics and coding. So during my BSc, which was mainly in maths, physics, and electronics, and my MSc was in physics, I had an excellent training and exposure in mathematics. During the COVID lockdown period, I rejuvenated my interest in applied mathematics and statistical analysis. Also, I learned a bit about nonlinear dynamics, and I have also started, or rather, restarted computer programming and coding, which has kept my interest quite high. This has also added a new impetus to my research, and hopefully it should reflect on various different things I am going to do in coming future. So therefore I have learned that mathematical thinking is very important. Of course, I am an experimental physicist, and generally there is always quite a bit of mathematics which we have to use in our work. But I've also increasingly found a great joy in understanding mathematical processes, mathematical analysis, and it also keeps people very engaged, and this is something I have also thoroughly enjoyed. So my lesson number 10 is to give emphasis on mathematics, including statistics. My lesson number 10, or rather lesson number 11, is that a professor can act like a postdoc. A research strategy which I found useful in my work is to treat myself as a postdoc in my laboratory. Given that in India, retaining a long term postdoc is generally difficult, many of the skills and thought processes cannot be effectively transferred from one generation to another generation within a PhD cycle. So a long term research problem, as you probably would kind of know, is to be sustained for a long period. Then the effort should also be sustained for a very long period. So as an experimental physicist, it is easy to get caught up in activities outside the lab and lose touch of the so-called optical bench work. So the lockdown period during the COVID pandemic actually broke that particular cycle, and I was only person in my laboratory during that particular time, and almost for 6 months I restarted doing experimental work, and I really valued that particular time. It also actually helped me to realize why at the beginning of my research career I became a researcher. That is because I really enjoyed working in the laboratory, and I'm hoping that that lesson of professor being a postdoc, which is a lesson number 11, will be valuable going in future. The lesson number 12 is to self mentor yourself. A lot of academic advice is written by people who work in the Western hemisphere. A few of them are general and excellent. In fact, I have greatly benefited reading and understanding the process of doing science by reading a lot of people in the Western part of the world. Some of them are applicable to Indian academia, but many of them are not applicable at all. In such a situation, as an academic, I try to derive inspiration by reading uh, people who have done some very important work and great work within India. For example, I have been deeply influenced by people like Vishweshwaraya, Rodham Narsimha, Gagandeep Kang, and Ashok Sen, Rohini Godbole. So many good people are there, and there are very good examples for us to pick and choose and get motivated from, and do some meaningful work going in future. So my lesson number 12 is to actually cultivate a habit of self mentoring, which is something I really value going forward. Lesson number 13, and a very important lesson, is to actually be rational and yet compassionate. So I have coined this particular term as compassionate rationality. I'm sure many people would have already used this particular term. I have also written about this in my blogs. I generally think that rationality is something which we have to emphasize in our country and in our society, and rationality and compassionate kind of viewpoint can coexist. This is an important point. Personally, I might be a scientist and an atheist, but I don't need to be condescending of people who are religious or who are deeply embedded in some particular spiritual activity. Of course, one should always call out pseudoscience and ensure that people are not misled. But we should also be compassionate towards people who would want to understand science. We cannot actually sit in our ivory towers as scientists and pontificate that this is how the science should be done. There is an important compassion viewpoint which is necessary, which has to amalgamate with the rationality. It is important also that we highlight rationality as a particular venture which is very inherent to our culture. It is not something very foreign. You know, rationality is not some Western concept. Rationality has a deep root within the civilization through which we have all evolved through, and we have also learned, we have also kind of mixed with various different cultures and developed this process of thinking. For example, Amartya Sen's book on argumentative Indian has excellent references on kind of looking at how this thought process evolved within Indian culture. So if somebody wants to explore, I would also urge Steven Pinker's book titled Rationality, which is also equally interesting. So therefore, it is important to be rational, but also to be compassionate in our thoughts and in our action, because empathy, which is just a feeling for someone, should generally be replaced by compassion, which is not only just the feeling but also a call for action, where we take some specific measure to cater to the interest of the people. Lesson number 14 is India as a country is hungry for education. So, hunger for education should be transformed to hunger for knowledge and skill. Because what has happened is education has become a kind of a churning process which leads to something. It has become a kind of a means to something very different end. So therefore, education has to be somehow reoriented, and somehow has to be given lot more emphasis in the way we actually live our lives. So developing skills is important. So is to develop scientific viewpoint in our daily life. Education cannot and should not stop with schools and colleges. This is one of the important lessons I have been learning, that education should not be just restricted to only schools and colleges. So therefore, a science outreach is important not only for children but also for adult population. Think about it, a lot of important decisions in our society are made by adults. If they do not have a scientific viewpoint, then there is no point actually asking our children to be scientific in their thought process. It is important that a large part of the society actually is scientifically oriented and values science as an important part of our lives. Therefore, lesson number 14 is that India as a country should transform its hunger of education to knowledge and skills, which will lead to betterment of our country, and also betterment of our humanity, which is equally critical. The lesson number 15, which is the last lesson, is learning is central to what I do, which means that I also have to develop a deep sense of humility. It is important for me, being an academic scientist, to treat people with respect and also realize that I do not know so many things. It is also a good way for the work to proceed with minimal resistance, because if ego comes into the picture, then it is a detrimental fact to the process of learning itself. So I generally keep telling myself that a professor is essentially an advanced learner. So therefore, learning should never stop, and learning will continue as long as one is interested, and that particular interest has to be sustained as part of what we do. So these are the 15 lessons which I wanted to share with you, and I hope that it will be of some use to you, and also provoke some thoughts. Do explore a blog that I wrote about a year or so, similar, or exactly on the similar lines, where I've expanded some of the things in this particular video, and also in the audio, by the way. And the show notes will also have some particular references. So this is Pratidwani, where we try to humanize science.